Well, good evening. At 6 o'clock, we'll get started on this special governing body meeting, May 31st. Before we get into the agenda, if we could, as a matter of practice, we'll call roll, and then Councilman Lesser would like to offer an invocation before we get started. So, Kelly, if you'll call the roll.
Mayor Padilla,
Here.
Council Members Hiller. Here. Valdivia Acala.
Here.
Ortiz. Emerson.
Here.
Kell. Nager.
Here.
Dobler.
Here.
Duncan. And Lesser.
Here.
We have 7 present.
Thank you. And as I stated, Councilman Lesser would like to offer an invocation. So would like us to stand and do a pledge of allegiance as
Sure.
well?
Yep.
We could stand as you're able for the invocation and remain standing for a pledge of allegiance.
I'd like to offer an invocation tonight. Late this afternoon, I received a call from Mr. Barry Feeker, who's given so much to our community. As he was headed to the airport, his only grandson, Jake, who's 10 years old, this weekend had 107th degree fever, now has sepsis and is in ICU in Washington, D.C., and Barry is en route as we speak. And so I just asked that we could bow our heads, say a quick prayer for him and his grandson. Lord, we ask you if you would please be with Barry as he travels to D.C. to be with his family. We also ask that you wrap your arms around Jake to heal him. We know as your children we are to come to ask you for healing, and we do that. For a man who's given so much to this community, we hope that you can hear our prayers as we ask for healing for his grandson. In your name, amen.
Amen. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. We want to make sure we note that Councilwoman Ortiz is also present for this meeting as well. We have a short agenda, but that doesn't mean we're going to have a short meeting. I do want to encourage everyone, as we start this discussion, that we be respectful of each other and give everybody an opportunity to express their thoughts and ideas. Make sure that we all share that time so that everyone has that chance to present their thoughts and ideas. It is hoped that this body will be able to come to some point where we can give specific direction, because I think that's our responsibility. We have relied upon staff over some period of time to provide a lot of detailed information. We have a presentation to receive tonight. Listening to that will give everyone an opportunity to ask questions as necessary, and then follow up with any kind of recommendations the governing body may want to make and bring before us for consideration. So, if we can get started, I would appreciate City Manager.
Thank you, Mayor and governing body.
Tonight, we are doing a special meeting on downtown parking and the parking plan. All of you have received a lot of information and background information leading up to this meeting. The plan tonight is we're going to start off with a short presentation, reference the downtown information, and with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Tryon.
Thank you, Mr. City Manager. So as you mentioned, there was a variety of information that was shared prior to the meeting. We want to go over some quick highlights, and that obviously will give us a chance to answer any questions or if there's any points of clarification we need to make on the information that was shared. So starting with just a general overview of our agenda today. Going a little too fast there, excuse me. First thing we want to do is just have a quick overview of our parking assets. Cover some of the information about the current revenue and expense associated with each of those assets. We'll spend some time talking about the parking plan recommendations that were given to us by a study that was conducted several years ago, and then cover what some of the remaining guidance that we need from the governing body. So first, I wanted to go over quickly what are our current assets and what are the policies that govern our parking in the city of Topeka. So what you can see on the screen right now is a map of our current parking assets. This is available online if anybody is looking for the rules governing parking and where they need to go to park. So we have 8 garages, 7 of which are currently operated by the city and 1 is city-owned. That are all on the map there. That covers 3,400 parking spaces. We also own 6 surface lots, which is 488 spaces. And then on street, we have 1,209 metered spaces. That does include the spaces that are currently hooded on the 100 blocks east and west of Kansas Avenue. And then we have 1,278 timed spaces that are also patrolled by our parking control officers. In total, that's 6,504 spaces that the city operates. And you can see all the names that we associate with the different parking garages and parking lots. One of the things that I learned when I took over this is that when I say the name of a parking garage, not everyone assumes what I'm talking about. So if at any point you're confused, and obviously we have more than one parking garage on Kansas Avenue and more than one on 9th Street, so feel free to clarify whenever I refer to them by name. This gives you a brief overview of the different parking assets and some information associated with them so you can have how many spaces are in each parking lot, what the current square feet is when they were built. This also shows you what the current appraised values are, the debt, what maintenance was projected based on some engineering assessments that we had done within the past 2 years, and then what the current revenue is. I've also included the revenue for pre-COVID because, as we know, what's happened in the past year and a half to 2 years has had a significant impact on our downtown. So when we're talking about revenue numbers, I want everyone to be aware that we are talking about them in a depressed revenue environment, and you can see what they were when we were in a more full occupancy environment a couple years ago. This is just a graph that shows the different expenses and how much each of them contributes to the expense of our total garage. The revenue there for the parking system is in blue, and then that large orange bar to the right represents the 10-year average for the maintenance projection. So as you can see, parking expense is pretty closely matched to revenue on an annual basis, but then when we include the deferred maintenance that is needed, that does take us quite below revenue neutral. And this is just that same information spelled out, so if there's any questions about the specific numbers associated with each of the assets or the expenses, we can certainly cover that. So what were some of the issues that were identified by the study that we had conducted? First of all, when we look at parking demand, what the study said was that there's not generally a shortage of downtown demand, but there are shortages in localized areas based on use. Also that the current plans don't necessarily overwhelm the parking system, but there is the potential for that in the future. And noted that the rates hadn't been changed since 2010, and that the current rate structure does not generate enough revenue to fully fund the expenses and the needed maintenance of the parking system's assets. There are a few other recommendations. I won't read all of them in detail, but they were included in the information that was sent prior to the meeting. Some of the other identified issues regarding policy. Currently, we do have 2-hour limits that are in place on Kansas Avenue and on the blocks east and west. That can contribute to some abuse of office workers who are jumping their cars from place to place. While they're allowed to do that by statute, we do encourage anyone who is going to be downtown for the entire day to look for an off-street parking space if possible, and not take up on-street parking, as we prefer those spaces be available to visitors or people who are coming downtown to do business for a shorter period of time. Some of the other recommendations that were made were regarding the operations and some technology improvements that need to be made. Some of those have been implemented since the study was conducted. And the study did note that while we do have a plan in place for capital repair and maintenance, there are not dedicated funds in order to fund those repairs and replacements. So some of the guidance that we need, or some questions that we want to pose to the governing body, is that currently our parking operations are self-sufficient. They are completely funded out of their own revenues and do not commingle with general city funds. Is it the will of the governing body that we will continue that arrangement, or will we enter in a different arrangement where other funds from the city's treasury would be devoted to parking assets? What recommendations that were recommended from the previous study that have not been adopted should be adopted? And then what is the preference for ownership of parking assets? So we have discussed over the past several months the possibility of other parties that may be interested in purchasing some of our parking garages or parking lots. What is the will of the governing body regarding those assets as a whole and individually? Just that we have an understanding of what has been done since the study was put in place. Many of the operational things have been taken care of. We instituted some new software systems that govern our enforcement and govern purchase of permits, and then also allow us to track better who is in the garages and what our occupancy is, and put all of our city-managed parking garages onto one software system so that we don't have different operating systems that we are managing across all of our garages. Some of the things that have not been implemented is that the rates still have not been increased since 2010. We still do not have a capital maintenance plan that is fully funded to cover all the costs that we anticipate. We still have hooded meters that are downtown. The recommendation was that we should either decide that we are going to not have meters in those locations and remove them entirely, or remove the hoods and charge for those spaces. And we still don't have price differentiation between high and low occupancy areas. Currently, most of our parking is uniform across the board, and that we still have the issue of some 2-hour limits that are in place both on Kansas Avenue and on the blocks immediately east and west of Kansas Avenue. So those are the recommendations that were made when the study was conducted that have been implemented and not implemented. And with that, unless there's any questions about the information that's been shared, I'll go back to some of the high-level points about the guidance needed and turn it back over to the city manager for discussion.
Thank you for the presentation. Are there any questions from the body on the information? Councilwoman Ortiz.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I didn't catch the gentleman's name that was talking. When did the 2-hour parking get changed that you could park there for 2 hours and then move to a different space, and then park there for 2 hours? Because I was told that our parking control officers, they should have been running those tags, and if they move, they get ticketed. They were only allowing 2 hours per vehicle downtown per day. So when did that get changed?
So there is a technical issue, and that one that we don't necessarily discuss a lot, which is that we have the ordinance in place allows people to park in different zones, different 2-hour zones. So Kansas Avenue is its own 2-hour zone. Each block east and west of Kansas Avenue is a separate zone. So it is possible to park in one of those areas for 2 hours, relocate your vehicle to another block, and not be ticketed. If you stay in the same general zone or in the same zone on each block, you would not be ticketed. Or you would be ticketed if you move spaces within the block, but if you are changing blocks, you would not receive a citation. So that's where some of the abuse takes place. That has been the case by statute. So the way the statutes are currently written, we cannot enforce it any other way.
When did that change, Jason?
That has been in place since the yellow hooded meters were installed. So if that was not the intention of the governing body, that is the way the statute is currently written and enforced.
Well, that was never the intention, because, it was always argued if my wife took my car and she got a ticket and I came back down there, then and I came for another 45 minutes and I could get a ticket. So I don't know when that was changed, but I would like to know, because things get changed and we don't know about it. And that's how the abuse was stopped with some of the city or state workers, is because if they would, I don't care what zone they were in, if they would run those times, they could only park down there for 2 hours. So I would like to know when that's changed and who authorized that to change. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councilman Lesser.
I just, point of clarification, you're talking city code, not Kansas statute, correct?
Correct.
So just want to make sure that we're clear on that.
Okay. Councilman Emerson.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to, I guess, I had that same question. That was my understanding. And I think if we look back, 2 or 3 years ago, we had a presentation on parking. And at that time, and maybe it was an error at the time, but it was explained to us that I want to say between 6th and 10th, you can only park anywhere in that 2 hour zone, that free parking zone, for 2 hours, even if you moved parking places. That was how it was explained to us at the time. And I guess my feeling would be, no matter what other things we want to do here with parking garages and such, if that's not the case right now, I personally think we want to fix that. So if we need to redo that city code, I would be in support of that. Thank you.
So just to clarify, that is true on Kansas Avenue. So Kansas Avenue was specifically created by code as a block zone, that anywhere between 6th and 10th on Kansas Avenue, it is 2 hours per day anywhere on Kansas Avenue. That is not the current enforcement mechanism for the yellow hooded meters that are immediately east and west of Kansas Avenue.
Thank you for that.
Councilwoman Nager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for this presentation. It's been very informative without bogging us down with too much. But my question is, as far as the 2 hour limits and all of that sort of stuff, that's all being enforced Monday through Friday, like during work hours, correct? That does not extend into the evening hours and onto the weekends, correct?
That's correct. All of our enforcement and all of our statutes are Monday through Friday, excluding holidays, from 8 a.m. until 6 p.m. Nights and weekends are free.
Excellent. And then for people who have been hopping around, what's the best way to go ahead and get parking for longer than 2 hours? Is it to use the parking garages because that's the intended use for those areas, and to keep those the street parking for people who are there for less than that, under 20 minutes?
Correct. So we would encourage anyone who's
Okay.
going to be downtown for longer than 2 hours to either park in a parking garage or to use one of our 10-hour meters. So we do have several spaces that are designated for 10 hours. You can also buy a 10-hour permit on a monthly basis, would entitle you to park at a 10-hour meter without paying each time. We also have a few 4-hour zones around the city that are a little bit further away. You do have to walk a little bit more, but have been very popular with some of our shift workers who maybe come to work on like a 4 to 10 shift, or only work in the mornings, where they can come, not have to pay for parking while they're only working for 4 hours at a time downtown, but not all day. So those are popular with some of our restaurant employees or other retail employees who work from, say, 2 to 10 shifts.
Awesome. Thank you for explaining that. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
If I could, Councilman Emerson.
Oh, thank you, Mayor. One other question for Mr. Tryon. I noticed on the contractual requirements to sell, which is, I guess, page 5 of the PowerPoint, it mentions that for I know one of the garages that there's been some interest expressed by a private entity in buying is the Townside Plaza. And I see that it says that the value of that sale is actually set by a panel of appraisers. I guess, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. So we do have several garages that do have ownership agreements where there is right of first refusal or some other covenants that are in place that were highlighted there, just as an intention of making sure the governing body is aware of any additional boxes that would need to be checked before we would pursue a sale of those assets.
Thank you for that. And I guess on that particular one, a panel of appraisers, it seems like that's something we typically see when we are condemning land or something where we select one, maybe the buyer. Can you tell me how that process would work?
I'm going to defer to the city attorney on that question. I don't know specifically what the rules would be in place if we were to execute that.
I'll look it up for you. I don't have the contract in front of me. I was trying to find it to read what that contract requirement was.
Okay, and I guess my question is going to be, and I know I'm maybe jumping ahead a little bit here, but since the presentation mentioned it, I wanted to ask while the presentation was still up. At some point, I guess we would need an appraisal to even know what the, what it's appraised at, I guess, right now. At some point, we need to do that. If that's a mechanism that we'd have to sell it based on, I guess we need to get an appraisal at some point so we know, what we're dealing with here.
That's something we could certainly pursue with any of the assets that we were considering selling. So the current appraisal values that are listed there are based solely on the county appraisals, which are conducted. They are not necessarily in-depth or independent appraisal that we've had by a party specifically related to a parking asset.
Okay, thank you, Mayor.
Councilman Dobler?
Thanks, Mayor. Could you go to slide 7, please? Okay, so this differs from the slide deck that we were sent the other day, which at the time showed really almost a break even for the garages without factoring in the 10-year projection for capital maintenance or capital that's needed to bring the garages back up to speed. So now we're showing an annual loss of $1 million.
So we added that information today per request.
Right.
What you're seeing there is the annual loss of the top 60,000, approximately 60,000, is in reference to the current annual budget. So that is the 2022 budget. So the current annual budget does not include the additional recommended capital improvements that have been recommended and that we've discussed several times in different meetings and have been talked about by this body before. We included those numbers just to give a representation of what additional costs have been recommended at this point, but those costs are not currently in the operating budget, and so we did not include them in the annual operating loss.
Not sure I'm totally following that.
So for example, the $61,057 you're seeing at the top in red, that does not include the $1,475,000.
All right, so you added that as a column at the end then?
Correct.
Yeah.
It is not currently factored into the annual budget.
But factored or not, it needs to be done, correct?
That is the recommendation of the assessments we had done.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Councilwoman Hiller?
Regarding that column, and thank you for adding it, I'll have to look up on the screen, I guess. What do those numbers reflect? Do they reflect annual expenses every year forever, or estimated, of course, or for 10 years to get the garages caught up, or is that maybe debt service because we would hurry up and do them in a year or two, or?
So those numbers are specific to the assessments that we had done in 2020 that estimated a 10-year plan to bring the garages up to all of the deferred maintenance that had been missing for the past several years. So that is taking those numbers and dividing them by 10 to get a rough annual expense of the amount that would need to be spent every year for the next 10 years. That is not accurate per se of what we would exactly spend in each year. We wouldn't likely, for the sake of operations, be working on all of the garages at once. If we entered into making these improvements, we'd likely do some garages first and then some later so we could overlap and not have to displace all of the customers that we have parking. But it is intended to estimate if all 10 years of that maintenance was done and applied across a 10-year budget, what would that look like on an annual basis? So that is not intended, for example, as this will be the new maintenance amount every year going forward. It is intended as this is what we need to spend every year for the next 10 years to catch up, as you said.
And I appreciate that. That would probably explain back when we were first starting to talk about ARPA money, there was a $10 million figure in there. And I'm glad you went back to 2020, because what I remembered was that in 2020, and we got a copy of that just to refresh on it, but you all crunched all those numbers and did extend, at least model, what you thought we needed for the various elements like we have here. You touched on the fact that you didn't, can the conditions of our garages handle having them done in sequence over a series of 5 to 10 years rather than
So
right away?
a good amount of that expense we would probably need to incur within the first few years. So it would not exactly be an equal amount every year. Based on the status of the garages and where we could displace parkers while improvements were going on, we would try to stagger that out so that which garages we felt were the most in need would be done immediately. That's not to say that we wouldn't do some of the improvements on the other garages if they were a concern for safety, for example. We could do those, but our intention would be to do them in some sort of sequence that makes sense so that we don't have construction going in every garage at once.
Thank you, and maybe I'm getting ahead of the discussion here, but when you did that modeling in 2020, there was discussion of beginning to notch the rates up as well. And in many ways, we just have this 2-year bite out of that 10-year plan. The figures that you've given us are based on still not having raised the rates.
That's correct. So
Correct.
the operating revenue that you're seeing here does not include any projections for any rate changes into the future. There were some recommendations that were made in the previous study regarding increasing rates and ratcheting it up over time, but none of those decisions were implemented or nothing happened on that front since then. We continue to operate at the same rates that we have since 2010.
And that's understandable. And I'm going to ask you another question, and any answer to it is okay. Have you all internally done some modeling yet? I understood from city manager that they didn't want to ask you to do any modeling before this meeting, so we don't have it, and that's fine. But have you played with it internally? Yes.
So my title is Budget Analytics Manager, and so I have modeled a lot of different things over the course of my time here. So yes, we have looked at different scenarios, but they are all just projections into the future, dependent on potential rate increases. Would it cover enough? But they're all dependent on different models, different estimates of how it would affect demand and so forth. So nothing that we have presented or shared, but we have done some internal calculations over time.
So depending-
Councilwoman, I have a request. Would you email that slide to make sure we have that
Certainly.
as an updated piece? And to help move the conversation along, I want to ask the city manager, we want to keep focused in our conversation so we don't jump ahead of ourselves and try to keep it in an orderly fashion. So, city manager, you have a suggestion with regards to how we start with regards to, I think, in the area of funding?
Yes, sir. But first, real quick, the city attorney does have the answer to Mr. Emerson's question, if we'd like to provide that.
Sure. I pulled the contract. So the contract provides that if the two parties, us and the owner of town site, can agree on fair market value, then that's the end of it. That's the price they pay. If fair market value cannot be reached, that's when a 3-person appraisal panel comes into place. One appraiser picked by the city, one by the owner of town site, the third mutually agreed upon by the two parties. The majority opinion of the 3 is binding.
And
Thank you.
And then real quick on financing, for maintenance in the CIP 23 budget is $3 million and $2.1 million in 24 for maintenance.
Thank you.
All right, Mayor, my recommendation would be basically slide 10. And those 3 questions there are what we as staff need answered as we try to roll out the wishes of the governing body. So the first question that I think we need to address is, are we planning on parking operations remaining self-sufficient or being subsidized by the general budget? And I would venture to say that most municipalities that have parking facilities, such as parking garages, at some point in their financing, do supplement the operating cost through the operations budget as well. So that would be kind of the first question that we need guidance on as we start to move forward.
Mayor,
Councilman Dobler?
city manager, is that based on polling that you've done with other cities, research? How do you arrive at the fact that most cities use general fund money for parking?
In conversations I've had with other municipalities, and the reason that they do that is because if you charge what you would need to charge to pay for them, the parking would be astronomical in cost. So they do supplement them for the most part with some type of operations.
It seems to me like we're drawing conclusions before we have a discussion, so I'd appreciate us being able to talk about that a little bit.
Would anyone like to add additional information with regards to that topic? Mr. Dobler?
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I am not ready to jump into the idea that we're going to supplement parking with general fund money. I think we need a lot of answers to the questions that have been asked, and really the questions that have been posed here about how do we finance the $14 million. Maybe back up. Is the $14 million still accurate? With prices going up 20, 30, 40%, depending on what you're looking at. How do we fund that? If we have adequate revenue, I assume we would probably bond that amount and try to get those garages repaired. That's obviously not the end of it. I mean, it's not like we're going to spend $14 million and then not have anything else beyond routine maintenance happen over the next 10 years. So what does that look like? I think we have to have that modeling and those questions answered before we can, and then, the other side of the coin is, what kind of revenue does it take? How much if the rates are going to be prohibitive, what does that mean? We need to understand what that increase. I think the numbers that we were brought a couple of years ago was, hey, give us the ability to raise garage rates anywhere between $60 a stall and $120 a stall, as I recall. That's too much. I mean, if it's going to be a range, it ought to be something that makes a little bit more sense. I don't think it means that this council's not willing to raise garage rates. I think we have to. I think we have to raise parking rates. I think we have to discuss parking everywhere. We just need to know what that pro forma looks like. So my answer to question one is not right now, till we better understand it. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Mayor,
Yes. I can't see.
it's Councilwoman Nager.
Oh, okay.
I'm hiding behind the slide.
Okay.
Okay, I'm back.
Councilwoman, there you go.
So I agree with Councilman Dobler. I think that obviously if we're going to charge things what they're worth, I do think that prices most everybody out of these spots. This is good real estate that can be used for many different things. But as we're looking at this, there is a responsibility of the government to make certain amenities more available to everybody. But with it being a certain section of parking spots for, especially whenever you look at all of the real estate that the state uses and does not get taxed for, and I might be speaking a little bit out of line, so if I need to be corrected, please do correct me. But with all of that real estate downtown going untaxed, it's really frustrating to me to think that the whole city has to subsidize the maintenance of these parking structures and parking spaces just to make one thing work. That doesn't seem like a model that makes sense for the long run for our city. And so while we are not going to be able to be self-sufficient with this particular department right away, I think that's something we should work towards. That it should be something more like utilities, where a lot more especially in the past few years since we have the hoods on the parking downtown and rates haven't been raised since 2010. This is something that we do need to reassess and be more realistic about what we want to see in the future. Also, do we want to go ahead and make it a priority of this council and make it clear to the people of the state that we want to move away from just having big slabs of concrete in areas that could be developed for much more, for businesses that could provide a lot more revenue and for the private citizens in our community and public revenue for our city to go ahead and better operate in the long run. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Okay. Further comment from the body?
I also like your red jacket.
Pink.
I'm glad you said red, not pink or salmon.
Like your salmon jacket.
No, not salmon.
Fuchsia.
I think you make some good points, Councilwoman. I do think that we've talked about this for some time now, and that was the purpose of this meeting, is to come to some idea and so we can give the direction to city manager and staff to provide the pro forma or what other additional information we need to make a decision. It's important that we take all factors into consideration, but considering and doing nothing doesn't help the situation. So I think we have to really resolve ourselves to what we want to see happen downtown and make sure that if we make a decision that it's based on as much information as we can get, but that we reach a point where we can make that decision. Having answered that first question, Councilman Dobler made it clear that he's not in a position right now to consider that. But I'd like to hear from other council members as well, so I can get an idea of what the feeling of the body is. I think it's important that we all understand each other's thoughts and ideas on this, so that when we come to that point and make a decision, that we do it for the overall good of the city, and that the council can support the final decision. It may not be exactly what any individual council member wants, but it has to be something that we can agree to as a body. So any further discussion about this would be appreciated. This is what this special meeting is for, so that we can talk about this particular topic.
And you're talking about item 1.
Item 1 right
Thank
now.
you.
Now, go down the list. Councilman Emerson.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll tell you, I think I'll kind of echo what Councilwoman Nager and Councilman Dobler said, that I do not want to see general fund money subsidizing parking. To me, that just doesn't seem fair. But furthermore, I'm really struck when I saw this profit and loss of different garages. It really screams out to me that, the Uptown garage, $8,000 a year revenue, and the insurance to it's $22,500 a year. The insurance is 3 times what we're getting in revenue from it. To me, I even wonder why we have that open. But I'm sorry, trying to stick to just number 1. I'm not in favor of supplementing as a general fund. So I guess that's where I am on that. Thank you, Mayor.
I appreciate that. Further comment?
Mr. Mayor,
Councilwoman Ortiz.
I too, until I fully understand all the parking downtown, and since they've changed, and until I fully understand the dynamics, I won't be in favor of it either. Because I feel like, at one time, they were giving out passes to well, I shouldn't say attorneys, but anyway, excuse me, Amanda, I know me and you, but it was them that was taking advantage of it. And what was happening is they would come from out of state and they were getting this little thing that says, this is your get out of jail free card, so they wouldn't pay. So, because we wanted to welcome them and not write so many tickets to them. Well, when I go to Atlanta, I get a $20, I went to eat for an hour and I got a $25 ticket. They didn't give me no, you're not from here, welcome to Atlanta. And I know an attorney that he switches cars because they run them by their tags, and he switches cars. So he's always getting, that little free get out. So until I fully understand what we're doing, I understand, that we've lost, it's always been a negative in the revenue, but what are we doing to recoup those tickets? I know there was a big scream a while back and we had the boot and all of that, but I need to fully understand what is in process, because like I said, I didn't understand that you can go to a different zone and park there for 2 hours. And so you got people, they're jumping all over. And that's just the way it is. And it used to be at one time, of course, I've been on here a while, so I'm giving a little bit of history, but it used to be they only got free parking downtown during the holidays. And then we just got real, started giving, because we wanted everybody to come downtown. So we started giving it to them free, and that's hurt us as well. So until I fully understand, I'm not gonna support that either.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Councilwoman Valdivia Alcala.
Thank you, Mayor. I concur. Money shouldn't be coming out of the general fund. That's it.
I think I'm last.
Okay. Councilwoman Hiller.
I think I'm last. I agree. I would like to, when we get the modeling done though, to have the staff figure out what our shortfall is. We did have a 2-year gap here, and so we've lost ground on what we needed to do. So seeing whether, I'm okay with considering an infusion of dollars based on the gap that we had, but I'd like to see how it would run with cash, or if we need to bond to get this big work done.
Thank you for your comments. I appreciate that. And if I'm hearing that there's not a leaning toward using general fund money, what options do we have available that would help us consider other alternatives? And maybe that's a question for our presenter, or?
Mayor?
Yes.
If I could suggest, maybe,
Okay.
I think the next item on there is what remaining recommendations should be adopted. Maybe that's a good place to go, because it does talk about rate increases and things like that that might
Okay.
lead us to answer the question that you just asked.
Okay. Well, if we want to move forward with that.
Yeah, so the second item on there is actually referring to the parking plan that is in place. And so the question there is, do we want to move forward with the parking plan as is, or do we want to make some alterations to the parking plan and then move forward? So everybody received the parking plan, and that would be the point of discussion. I can turn it back over to Mr. Tryon, who can update us on what things have been accomplished and things that still need to be done.
So just a couple points of clarification. One is, as you're reviewing the information, you may see that sometimes the Uptowner is included and sometimes it is not. So as you're going through, just as a point of clarification there, the Uptowner is owned by the city, but we do not currently operate it on a day-to-day or monthly basis. So we do not receive any rental revenue from that garage other than a monthly revenue from the current operators of it. But we do not charge any individual customers for their rates at the Uptowner, and we do not control who goes in and out. So that's why sometimes you may see the Uptowner as obviously an outlier as we're looking at that information. I just wanted to explain that. And also to Councilwoman Ortiz's question regarding people who come from out of town and receive warning tickets. So our current policy is that if someone is from out of county or out of state, they do receive a warning the first time. It is done by license plate. So if someone is a frequent visitor to downtown, like for example, somebody who travels from outside the county but works downtown on a regular basis, they would receive tickets after they got their first warning. But Unfortunately, if someone is changing cars as frequently as the person who knows Councilwoman Ortiz, I suppose that it is possible they're getting away with it multiple times. What I can tell you is that contrary to what is commonly thought, citations are not a significant source of revenue for the parking department. We typically get about 5 to 7% of our annual revenue from parking citations. That 7% was last year, and it was slightly higher because of the loss of revenue that we saw in the garages. So typically it's around 5 or 6% of our revenue. If we were to eliminate that practice of offering warnings for guests from out of county or out of state, it would get us potentially another 1.5% of revenue based on the estimates we've made. So if that's the will of the governing body, we certainly can do that. But I just want to be clear on how much revenue that would be involved if we were to adopt that. In terms of revenue, I know to Councilman Dobler's point, there were some various presentations that were given in the past regarding different rate structures and a possible range of rates. The intention there is really about us having the flexibility to respond where people are wanting to park in certain locations. So right now, our current parking structure is that we charge the same for all garages with the exception of the 9th Street garage, which is the one at 215 Southeast 9th Street. And at times we have scenarios where there is a waiting list for people to get into certain garages and we have available space at other garages, but we don't have the flexibility to charge differential rates. So in terms of discussing the rates, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Hannah Yorig, who can speak a little bit more about the recommendations that were made in 2020.
So to elaborate a little bit on what Jason was saying, the range, as Councilman Dobler recalled, was correct, and it was up to $120, which was not necessarily the intention to charge immediately. But based on the Desmond study, it had been recommended that we plan for a approximate 10% increase every 3 to 4 years just to keep up with the rate of inflation and changing markets. And so we do have some garages that are reserved spaces, so it is a 1-for-1. Which is where we would have recommended to charge more as you have a designated space for you, and we cannot oversell those garages. But the intention on that, as Jason has said, was to level out demand. So we could charge more and target an 80 to 85% occupancy in the high demand garages and charge less in some of the other outlying ones. In the original study done by Desmond, we had started at $67.75. And it recommended on the first increase to get up to a $75 rate. The second increase, 8 years later, $83, and by the third, $91. So the intention with that range was to give some flexibility to the team while also not having to revisit it every few years if the need wasn't there.
Any questions for Ms. Ulrich? Councilman Emerson.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, Ms. Ulrich, I remember the discussion a few years ago on this, and I thought at that point, didn't we give you the authority to differentiate the rates on those, or did we not?
We were getting close, and then unfortunately COVID happened, and everything went on pause. So we had been discussing the change in ordinance. We had drafted the ordinance change, which would cause fluctuation not only in garage rates, but also on street and in parking ticket rates to coalesce with all the different pieces together. But unfortunately, March happened and it got put on the back burner.
Okay, thank you.
Councilwoman Hiller.
I wanted to fill in a little back on that and give credit to the staff for that early planning and where we are, setting us up, I think, for where we are now. If you recall, one of the things, and it's noted a little bit here in this summary, was to, on the meter end of it, be using the boxes instead of installing meters again in the future, but also setting up a centralized system that would allow people to pay with a credit card, recognizing that all policy aside, most people just don't want to have to carry around a bunch of quarters. They don't, I recall these discussions at DTI and here, just don't mind paying, but it's having to carry around all this heavy change. And so we're set for the meters that we have, at least in part, for the being able to pay with a credit card instead of with cash. And then in the garages, getting them all on the same computer system so that we can mix and match and move people around. We're all ready to do that. Is that right?
We have already implemented that, Councilwoman.
Right, so that those were supposed to happen in the very first year of the plan that did happen. And so we're more prepared than we were when that plan was done to put those flex rates into action. And there'll be some changes in this plan for how the zoning of the rates and parking is happening as well, but we're ready to go, right?
For the most part, I will add a change to the plan from our original 2020. We were planning on installing all new digital meters where there were mechanical meters currently. That was a very costly capital expenditure that we have modified to allow for credit card payment via the app with the passport stickers that we have put on our mechanical meters. To adjust our mechanical meters to allow for us to differentiate pricing by zone would be quite an undertaking, and quite frankly, I don't know that all the meters would actually be capable of changing at this point. So on-street differentiation would be limited to potentially Kansas Avenue, and then the rest would maintain where they're currently at, just with the limitations that we have by maintaining those physical meters. We could remove them and go, as many cities have done, and do app-only payment in certain areas of the city. That would allow us a little bit more flexibility to do that, but that's not currently how we are structured, and we'd look for guidance from the governing body on what direction to go forward with.
And some of those are fairly complex, and you move fast. But a lot of cities and even resorts and things like that are using just a single box on a block where you go and you enter your parking space number and pay at the box rather than by the meter. And I know we had talked about that.
Yes.
Is that one of the options that you're looking at now?
We could integrate that with our current system. So we would not have to make significant changes to install pay stations to where someone could pay by physical coin or credit card,
Right.
without having to have to buy physical meters for all of the areas that don't have meters today.
Well, I will say, under these remaining recommendations, I think that's the way to go. And I also think that we've looked at this problem with the bagging on the meters on the sides, but free on Kansas Avenue. I think that original plan had us metering or charging for Kansas Avenue by now. And so as we look at getting some modeling back, I think, and we talked it all the way through, inside out and up and down at DTI, and people were ready to go with that. They knew that's where we were going. It was supposed to happen in steps, but they knew that's where it was going. And so that could help us feel like we're really getting the entire plan in place when we get going. So I would suggest that we address all of the metering in year one, for instance, when we model it out.
Councilman Dobler.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think just kind of walking down through these bulleted items, I certainly feel like we have to have rate increases of some sort. I mean, just the fact that we're in whatever kind of inflation we're at right now, 6, 7, 8%, rates have to go up. I think we need to look at, I mean, people understand that the hooded meters have got to go away at some point. So I think my recommendation would be to look at rate increases, remove the meters on the side streets. I would like to look at what it takes to not put meters back on Kansas Avenue. I mean, that's not a byproduct of the Kansas Avenue project that was recently completed. Those meters have been gone since 1985. So it's a little bit different than the side streets. Not saying that I wouldn't support that, but I'd like to know what exactly that adds to the revenue. I think we've already talked about the 2-hour limits. You know, if we come back with, well, if we remove the bags on the side streets, then we're back to just a single zone for Kansas Avenue, and that issue is gone at that point. I wonder if we can get to an understanding of how the fund might work before we get into all of the price differentiation and all of that stuff. I'm not smart enough to understand that. So if we could keep it simple, like, you know, doing these things. Scenario one, if we bond enough money to fix the garages, put enough money in our budget for realistic ongoing maintenance of those garages, which I don't think we have at this point in time. Scenario one maybe is, okay, we don't sell any garages. What is it going to take to achieve enough revenue to keep the fund solvent? Scenario two, what can we do with disposing of one or more garages that will increase the stability of the fund, lower the amount that we have to raise the rates, whatever that looks like. And I'm sure there's a scenario 3 or 4 that other council members might have, but I think that would get us to a discussion starting point that we could understand from a financial standpoint without the variable rate stuff. We can always add. It's easier to add than take away. So it's just my recommendation, Mayor, that we keep it fairly simple to start with and understand kind of the base scenario that we've got. Thank you.
Councilman, in what format or in what form would you like us to, as a body, consider that thought, those ideas and those alternatives in this particular meeting or one specific down the road as an agenda item? Because I do agree with you. I do think that we have to raise some rates.
Right.
I do think that we have to make a decision with regards to the hooded meters. I think that we have to move forward and keep in mind that whatever we do is for the continued growth of downtown, but some practical moves that we have to do as a governing body with regards to finances and using the money that we are entrusted with in a wise way. So do you have a thought or an idea or a suggestion?
Yeah, I think if we, if staff is able to get through kind of that modeling, which it sounds like Jason's probably pretty close already, maybe email that out to the council so we have time to digest it. Seems like we could do that as a presentation at a council meeting, at least understand the models, the scenarios, I guess, that they're presenting, and then give direction to staff as far as what kind of ordinances or resolutions we'd like to see generated out of that. And if we get to that point and it looks like that's the right path, then maybe we look at some other additions to that. I mean, I think that makes sense. I think there's some flexibility that can be built in, but only after we really understand what the base scenario is. So I guess to answer your question, maybe just at a council meeting, 30-minute or less presentation that we can absorb the information and then make recommendations from there. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilwoman Nager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think Councilman Dobler is right on track. I think starting off with the presentation now that we have kind of dipped our toes into this in, I think, a very calm way, we all know a little bit more about this, and it's been helpful also to hear that there have been different things crafted already, but as Mr. Ulrich had mentioned. And so I would like to see that mock-up of the ordinance to make sure that the parking department has the flexibility to go ahead and raise or modify rates as they see fit. Again, working towards that self-sufficiency. So not every time we need to go ahead and say that a parking spot needs to be 25 cents more. That doesn't have to be something that's bogged down by the bureaucracy of having to go to the council. And so I would like to see that in a presentation, but I think it would also be good to go ahead and get the deputy mayor and Councilman Kells, get them up to date too on this, because I think it's very important since it's something that the entire city subsidizes, and we see that it's really being focused in one particular area for one particular resource. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Councilwoman Hiller.
Real quickly, there was in the 2020 update, which we all got as one of our handouts. These don't have page numbers, but I think it's the third page was called a working draft, and it was called a parking deployment plan. And it actually ran out for 10 years, revenue, expenses, set aside for maintenance, what the net balance was. And then it talked about what the fees would be in the garages and what the fees would be on the street, and had a 3-year meter deployment plan in it. And I guess that's what, in my mind, I go back to and say, okay, we had 2 years just bid out of that. You know, can we catch it up or start where we left off, and how would that look? And maybe with some varieties, but I thought that this put an awful lot of information on one page that was really helpful for us to look at. So just as a thought.
Thank you. Further comment? Mr. City Manager, I want to make sure that we've covered all the topics under those 3 points, and I think we have visited a bit about the parking garages as well, correct?
Yeah, Mayor, I didn't know if there was any other discussion on the parking garages specific, but the feedback we've gotten has been very beneficial so far.
Thank you. I appreciate the comments that have been made. For my part, I want to make sure that we consider all the alternatives, as Councilman Dobler talked about, that maybe one of the modeling options that we have is that we don't maintain ownership of all the garages. We look at whether or not they're actually helping us achieve our goal to improve downtown or keeping us from meeting that goal. And I know I've heard sometimes the thought that we want to make sure that the government is in control of everything, because we don't want private sector to get involved and maybe raise the rates and take it out of our hands so that we have no say-so in those operations. I'm not comfortable with that kind of thinking, to be honest with you. I think private industry does a lot to help our community, and a lot of times we think the government is the best place to place all the responsibility, but we rely upon the businessmen in our business community to show us those practical things that sometimes get bogged up in government work. The bureaucracy of governing sometimes gets in the way of practicality. So I want to make sure that we consider all options that are available to us, to include even the sale to private entities as well. I am glad that we've had this meeting and conversation, because it tells me that we have the information in front of us. It just needs to be a little more customized, I think, to make the entire governing body comfortable with the final decision that we make, that we've used every opportunity to look at the modeling that maybe has already taken place, making a good dive into the finances and utilizing staff to provide that information so that we can make the decision. And I think that has to be done by this governing body. I'm not saying in 2 weeks or 3 weeks, but I would like to see that information shared with the governing body so that it can be sent to the city manager so that he can look for a date that it can be brought to the governing body as an agenda item so we can make some definitive decisions. And we've had plenty of discussion. It's time to make some decisions. And I think that that information that will come to us will help us do that. But we do need to make some decisions on this. If there's any other comment, Councilman Dobler.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to say this was a great presentation. Jason, Hannah, Steve, city manager. You got all this stuff into 12 slides. Fantastic. Let's let that set the bar here. But all joking aside, it was good information, well presented. We know you've done a lot of work. We know you live and breathe this, and trying to maintain assets that are falling apart with no money. I think we're committed to getting you to a place that you have something that you can manage adequately. So we appreciate the effort. Braxton, you too. Thank you.
Thank you. Smile, Braxton. Come on.
He's not doing it.
Try.
Dang, I thought
Try just a little corner. I agree. we do ask a lot of staff, but I think they've been very responsive. If there was something that was left out of a report, it was only because we maybe didn't ask for it in the right way. So we have some responsibility as well. So I think we're doing a good job in acknowledging the work that you have been doing. And Mr. Tryon, I appreciate your time with us today as well. Hannah, thank you very much for your contribution. And Braxton, you too. City Manager, I appreciate it. Unless there's further discussion, I think that what we have come to is a direction.
Hannah.
Hannah? Okay.
I've got one more quick question.
Mayor? Uh-huh.
Thank you, Mayor Mike. So I would like to see in our presentation if there are any sort of zoning requirements for parking for the different businesses downtown. If we're requiring people to have a certain amount of spots that they don't necessarily need. That was just a note that I wanted to make sure that we got. But that's all, Mr. Mayor.
That's a good
Thanks.
point. Yeah, thank you for adding that. I think we've had enough conversation that we've given some direction to the city manager, and hopefully, city manager, maybe what, 2 weeks, we can, at the least, at the longest, have that modeling and those other additional options sent to the governing body so that we can get through them, look at them, ask any questions before we put it on the agenda. I want to make sure that when we put it on the agenda, we're going to do something that night and not just continue to talk about it.
Is that sufficient time?
We'll review the dates and get back to you to make sure that we can provide it well in advance.
Okay. How much time do you think you would need?
Likely only the 2 to 3 weeks to make sure internally we're aligned on the numbers, since we've done a lot of the modeling, but making sure they align with the direction you've given. And then we want to give it in advance, so it would be a month or two, I'm assuming, city manager, before we could get it on the agenda for council.
Take the time you need, but don't take all that time. Let's get it to us.
We're ready to have the conversation too, sir.
Okay.
Mayor,
Yes,
could I
Councilwoman
make a
Miller.
suggestion along those lines so that we don't have to go another round? And that would be that anybody on the council that has a particular model that they'd like to see, either reach out to you or city manager and let you know, so that that can be requested of staff and people get what they were wanting to find out about.
It's a good thought, but we'll follow the chain
Yeah.
and send it to city manager.
Okay.
And that way he can disseminate it to those parties who need to see it. Okay? Anything further? Nothing further for this body? This meeting is adjourned, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayor. Good night.